Usted puede adquirir una copia inédita de este documental Shutdown por Amazon.
Hola, les habla Alfredo Jacomino. A continuación, Televisión Martí presenta el documental Derribo, en el que se recuerdan los hechos acontecidos el 24 de febrero del año 1996, cuando el régimen cubano derribó en aguas internacionales a 2 avionetas civiles y desarmadas, acabando así con la vida de 4 jóvenes de la organización humanitaria Hermanos Al Rescate.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have just been briefed by the National Security Advisor on the shooting down today in broad daylight of 2 American civilian airplanes by Cuban military aircraft. I directed the United States Coast Guard units in the area to conduct search and rescue operations. I have instructed our interest section in Havana to seek an immediate explanation for this incident from the Cuban government.
Eyewitnesses from the Majesty of the Seas report hearing a large explosion some thought was a military exercise. One passenger caught the smoking aftermath on her video camera.
The planes were piloted by Brothers to the Rescue, an organization which aids Cuban rafters fleeing the island of Cuba. The group patrols the 90 miles of ocean between Cuba and the US, looking for people in rafts and small boats attempting the crossing.
The 4 men killed in Saturday's shootdown were Mario de la Peña, Carlos Costa, Pablo Morales, and Armando Alejandra Jr.
We had never shot down an American civilian plane. We shot down a plane of a terrorist organization based in the US.
The MiG-29s knew that the airplanes were civilian and that they posed no threat at all.
We had the duty to defend Cuban sovereignty and Cuban independence, and that's what we did.
I was struck by the joy of these pilots in committing cold-blooded murder.
I consider myself to be a marginal individual. You know, there's no way that I can ever be a real native-born U.S. American citizen, and I will never be a real Cuban citizen again because Cuba has totally changed. Our children have been born in this country. We are raising them mainly as Americans, but we cannot forget our homeland, we cannot forget Cuba, and much as we try to integrate into the United States, we will never be fully integrated.
The place where you're born has a special call, and I think that's the uniqueness of the Cubans. We're all hoping to go back. Our children are born in the U.S., but they live in stories of what's going on in Cuba. Everyday conversation from the grandparents, from parents, have somehow opened some type of curiosity in our children as to what's going on in that island, mysterious island.
I am Cuban American. My parents are Cuban. The blood running through my veins is Cuban, but I was born in this country. If someone, though, were to ask me, I had to choose between the two, whether I was Cuban or American, I would say I was American because this is the place where I was born, and this is my birthland, and this is the only home I know.
In the several years leading up to the shootdown, provoked by crisis conditions within Cuba, there had been a huge upsurge in illegal immigration. Balseros, rafters, were setting off in any kind of raft that they could construct to try to get to the United States.
They were taking down their doors from their homes just to have a piece of wood so that they could take to sea.
I can tell you that the people that took it upon themselves to jump in a raft were desperate people. I think the most dramatic case was 2 guys on a single inner tube. If you can think that, imagine that.
The escalating flow of people out of Cuba was a human disaster. There were stories on the news virtually every day about families who had risked everything and had wound up losing their lives.
Only 1 out of 4 Cuban rafters make it to the United States.
The rafts kept coming in with dead people, empty rafts. People who died just as the Coast Guard took them into their boats.
And Brothers to the Rescue began as a response to that crisis.
Brothers to the Rescue was born right here in this house. A good friend of mine from the past, Bill Shoes, came over and said to me, Jose, we should try to help the people that are dying right now in the Straits of Florida, organize the fishermen to go there and help them and so on. And I told him, Billy, I think your idea is good and your intention also, but with a boat we'll never accomplish that. We need airplanes, and I have one.
Okay, entonces copia, mira, son 10 personas, Hay un niño de 4 a 5 años, 3 mujeres y 6 hombres, y están pidiendo agua. Infórmale al Coast Guard. De nuevo.
Brothers to the Rescue served as a kind of spotter function, flying over the straits, radioing in when they spotted rafters, giving location, and certainly giving some encouragement and hope to people who were down below, sometimes in very desperate conditions.
We're looking at about 120 members now with 13 aircraft, and most of them are pilots. We're not all Cuban. I'm Cuban American. We have Argentinians, Peruvians, people from England, Switzerland, Venezuela, Colombia. People put aside their differences and cultures, and they come together for a common cause, and that's to save someone's life.
You hear people dying all the time out there in the water, and I'm able to do this. I mean, this is the only thing I'm not rich, so I can't give any donations of any sort, so this is what I can do, and I do it.
The greatest moment is when you see the plane.
Yes, sir. Good morning. Brothers to the Rescue, November 2456 Sierra, squawking 1205, 1205.
That was, the greatest moment, because at that point, you realize that your life came back to you. Until that point, you are dead. You're just waiting for the time, but you're dead.
Between Cuba and the United States is a big ocean. There was a very real need for coverage because the Coast Guard couldn't cover the entire area. So the concept of a civil air patrol flying out over international airspace, looking for people on rafts in harm's way, was a great idea.
We had a very positive relationship with Brothers to the Rescue. They saw a lot of things that we couldn't necessarily see at the time, and they provided us a great deal of information. They would let us know when they were going to go out and fly in the area so we wouldn't mistake them for a smuggler. And if they saw something they thought was suspicious activity, they'd give us a call about it and let us know that they saw it going on.
Brothers to the Rescue was performing not only a useful but a legal function. They were helping U.S. authorities identified political refugees on the high seas who were entitled to special treatment if they made it to the United States.
We just want to save someone's life and hopefully set an example for the Cuban community inside Cuba that if they unite, they can also take care of the problem, which right now is Castro.
There is not communism or Marxism in our ideas. Our political philosophy is representative democracy and social justice in a well-planned economy.
Fidel Castro desde Oriente, a Batista combatió. Fidel Castro desde Oriente, a Batista combatió. Y en la patria libertó con sus hombres dignamente. ¡Que viva Fidel! ¡Que viva Fidel! ¡Que viva Fidel!
In 1959, Castro arrived, and when he came in, for many people, including our family, we thought it was a good change because the previous government had been a repressive one. As time went by, however, many things started happening. There were trials where there wasn't really a due process, and inroads into private property, and the idea that somehow the state was more important than the family, that worried our parents and worried many other people. And eventually, at the end of 1960, my father left, and a week later we came to the States. We always thought it was going to be a temporary thing and that things were going to be straightened out in Cuba, but 40 plus years later, we're still here. When we left Cuba, I was 15 years old. My brother Armando was 10. My brother and I were particularly close. I was the oldest and he was the youngest. You tend to think that children can lose their country very easily and that you can transport a 10-year-old from one country to another without doing anything, without any sort of damage. But it was hard. It was also a way of life that we lost entirely.
If my father had to choose between being Cuban or American, I don't think that was a question that he would have been able to answer. To him, this country was everything in the world. He could not stand for injustice and he could not stand for oppression, and he had to help.
Mario was first generation Cuban American. He was somebody that at 24 had lived such a full life. His love for aviation was declared at a very early age, and you couldn't break him away from that. He was going to be a pilot, and a pilot he was, and a darn good one. Joining Brothers to the Rescue was like a joint venture. Here is my passion for flying, plus my desire to help others.
I always thought he was out of this world. His thoughts were always so different than the typical young individual. Struggled with the Spanish, but certainly could identify with the suffering of the Cuban people.
Dime tú, un piloto cortando coco. Esta gente habla en inglés y español. El perro este es bilingüe, lo mismo entiende español que inglés.
And he was very inquisitive. He always wanted to find out the why is this happening? Why these things that I'm seeing, why are they taking place?
Then he realized that something was happening in an island where so many people are trying to escape. What could possibly be going wrong? He once told us, he says, I don't know why you escaped the problem. If there was a problem in your homeland, why did you leave rather than resolve it?
Brothers to the Rescue formed not only to save lives, but to send that message to the Cuban people that the exiles had not forgotten them, and then we were only one country, one people, Cubans.
Our effort was very successful. By 1994, we had already located, and this is prior to the mass exodus that took place on that year, 4,200 Cubans.
It might look like a very close trip, but those 90 miles in the Straits of Florida have caused the death of thousands and thousands of people. There's no way that without Brothers to the Rescue, so many people would have been saved.
There is a risk involved, no question about it. Not only because we are talking about airplanes, but, you know, it could be accidents, it could be crash landings, bad weather, but the fact that we were dealing with a regime like Cuba, it might have made it more risky. We always thought that the worst that could happen is that they could force us to land in Cuba. We never thought that they were going to shut down planes. I mean, suicides, we are not.
Él decía que era lo mejor que le había hecho, que se sentía muy bien. Eso haciéndose que por favor no le dijera más nada porque yo tenía mucho miedo, porque cada misión eso exponía su vida.
Carlos Costa was a tremendous leader of the group at the time. He was the chief pilot at the time. They call him El Intenso because he was intense.
Y se fue involucrando que enseguida ascendió y después él el que hacía los planes de vuelo y contrataba y organizaba todo el vuelo. Hizo cantidad de misiones. ¿Me explica como cuántas misiones son?
Over 400 missions.
If there's something that's going to stay with me is the dedication that he had. Whatever he did, he was very passionate and intense individual.
It's very exciting and very rewarding. It's very few things you can do in life where you know you saved someone's life. And right now, I'm pretty sure we saved half a dozen there, or a dozen.
And to this day, really, no one knows how many people are out there that have never made it. There's no one to account for them.
Was a young rafter that we found in the Florida Straits, and out of gratitude he came to work for Brothers to the Rescue, offered himself as a volunteer. He wanted to become a pilot too, and we were going to train him for that, but you know, this occurred.
El hecho de que Hermanos Al Rescate les haya salvado la vida en mi hermano quedó un sentimiento de agradecimiento muy fuerte, muy grande. Y eso fue lo que lo hizo a él seguir en la organización ayudando voluntarios.
To us, he was a role model of how a person comes to this country and is able to rebuild his life.
Today is Thursday. Finish working 6 o'clock. I'm sorry, I don't remember speaking Spanish. English only. Únicamente hablo inglés y poco español.
En las cartas, yo tengo la primera carta que él me manda y nos cuenta la travesía, lo difícil que fue. Él nos cuenta y nos atesora a todos que no vayamos a cometer una locura semejante. Porque el mar es negro, el mar no es azul. Es muy peligroso, mi hermana. Nunca vayas a permitir que nadie que tú conozcas atraviese ese mar como lo atravesé yo.
Brothers to the Rescue had a very interesting group of people, and sure enough, we also had, that I know, 2 spies. Maybe there were more, but we had 2 spies in the group because the group became too threatening for the government of Cuba since the very beginning. That message of solidarity and the press that we were bringing along with us was devastating to the government of Cuba and its image abroad.
The threat of Brothers to the Rescue against the Cuban government was very strong because
It's a nonviolent organization, and it's been very effective in creating a bond or a bridge between the Cuban exile community and the Cuban people, because they've seen that the Cuban exiles here don't want to go back and take their land or, take their homes, but rather save their lives.
Roque was a former major of the Cuban Air Force, and he identified as such with us at the time, and we welcomed him as we welcomed anybody. We did not have a counterintelligence type of thing in Brothers to the Rescue to determine who is who and so on. Our operations were very open all the time.
He was a mole. His mission apparently was to infiltrate pro-democracy groups, especially those that are effective. As far as I know, Juan Pablo's mission was to report to Havana on the activities of Brothers to the Rescue. And that's exactly what he did. He very often flew with Basulto himself. He won Basulto over. I mean, he was good at that. He was perfect for Brothers to the Rescue because he could utilize his skills and his knowledge as a pilot to save lives in the Florida Straits.
Up until 1994, we assumed without further question that anyone arriving in the United States from Cuba was here for political reasons, that they were fleeing tyranny and seeking a life of freedom and democracy in the United States. There were escalating aspects of crisis in the 90s on migration policy that finally reached the point of the Cuban government essentially opening the gates.
Cuba was having really hard times, and we're now having a refugee crisis that is over 100,000 people, and a lot of them were just floating in to the Florida shore. The Florida governor was complaining, the Florida senators, the Florida congressmen were complaining. Do something.
The Cuban government discovered that immigration could be a weapon that Cuba could use against the United States. Using the threat of migration, the Cuban government drove the Clinton administration to the negotiation table.
The Clinton administration still didn't allow meetings between high-level officials of the United States and Cuba. So Scott Armstrong and I set up a dinner at a house in Georgetown. And after the dinner, Alarcón, the vice president of Cuba, he and Mort Halpern, who had the Cuba portfolio, spent, I think, 45 minutes to an hour after dinner in a private conversation to which I was not privy. Shortly afterwards, an agreement was signed. That set up the policy now of controlling immigration.
I have ordered that illegal refugees from Cuba will not be allowed to enter the United States. Refugees rescued at sea will be taken to our naval base at Guantanamo while we explore the possibility of other safe havens within the region.
From one day to the next, by a decision of President Clinton, Cubans were no longer political refugees. They were now to be treated like refugees from any other country in the world.
Within a few yards of reaching freedom, 6 Cuban refugees try desperately to evade capture by Coast Guard officers ordered to block their entry and return them to Cuba.
I remember the images of people trying to cross the Berlin Wall, and we're acting like the Gestapo or the Stasi and keeping them from coming to freedom. They've been suffering for 40 years. For Christ's sake, enough is enough.
An assumption was made that they were coming to the United States for economic reasons, and they would have to prove a well-founded fear of persecution if they were returned to Cuba in order to be granted political refugee status.
These people, when they're asked these questions, are in a desperate type of situation. They don't know really what to answer. They have no access to legal counsel, and mostly they are sent back.
This was the biggest change in the relationship between the United States government and the people of Cuba since the revolution itself had occurred. And it was made, frankly, without a lot of thought. Whatever your opinion of these changes on the part of the Clinton administration in immigration policy, the actual reason for Brothers to the Rescue disappeared.
When the immigration law changed, the Brothers to the Rescue mission had to be reevaluated. There's no sense in flying anymore because if we find them, they're only going to be returned.
We figured that we were doing more damage than good We did not want it to be instrumental in assisting Castro in patrolling the borders of Cuba on his behalf. But we still had the mission to save their lives. So for some time to come, we kept flying. And by dropping the radios, we asked them whether their situation was so precarious that they needed the assistance of the Coast Guard, no matter what, even though they would be sent back to Cuba or not. And that was their choice.
After 1994, Brothers to the Rescue changed, and they advocated democracy in Cuba directly rather than indirectly by just helping the rafters.
Brothers to the Rescue had three primary missions. Number one, to save lives in the Straits of Florida. Number two, to give a message of solidarity to the people of Cuba that we, the exile community, had not abandoned them. And number three, to expose the government of Cuba for the conditions that made it necessary for those people to jump on a raft. We were sending literature into Cuba on how they could organize themselves to oppose that government in an effective way. We were promoting nonviolence in Cuba as an instrument of change.
And they did do something that I thought was very ingenious. They would drop leaflets. The wind would blow these little pieces of paper into Cuba.
At one occasion, we flew over Havana. These leaflets which we dropped had to do with the International Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. One time we dropped 500,000 leaflets containing a message to the people of Cuba that they could engage that government non-violently, claiming for those rights that were inherently theirs.
Like many organizations that start with one purpose, but continue on even when that purpose disappears, Brothers to the Rescue decided that it would continue. Now it was a political weapon to tell the Cuban government that Brothers to the Rescue was capable of defying Cuban authority, of flying into Cuban airspace, of dropping leaflets over Havana.
We were doing what we're supposed to do as activists. We were simply demonstrating and bringing the fact to life that a repressive regime exists in Cuba and that nobody's doing anything about it other than making comments, complaints, stating political positions, and expressing desires. But actions to change that, very few are willing to undertake them.
Vice President Alarcón called Scott Armstrong and I in on one of our trips to Cuba to give us a message to deliver to Mort Halpern. And the message was a clear and distinct warning, emphasizing the gravity of the overflights and that the Cubans would not permit any more to take place.
We gave plenty of time to their masters, to the authorities that should have controlled them, who recognized that those activities were not justifiable, to simply not to do anything in our favor, but just to implement, to respect their own laws and regulations.
Estábamos tranquilos. Cuando le enviamos el mensaje, recibimos una respuesta afirmativa y nos aseguraron que se tomarían todas las medidas posibles, para evitar que se produjeran esas violaciones. Y nosotros confiamos, creímos en eso.
There was a demarche, a series of demarches that was done through the U.S. interest section, and I think, as a matter of fact, it was even spoken to Rick Nuncio, who was the president's special advisor at Cuba at the time. But in terms of the consequences, we'd shoot them down, I don't ever remember hearing that. And if it was said, it would have been lost in the rhetoric. When Fidel Castro says, I warned you, I warned you, I warned you, the system stopped taking him seriously because he's been saying things like that for 40 years. You don't know what I would call revolutionary rhetoric and what's real warnings.
How many members of Brothers to the Rescue knew that the Brothers to the Rescue they had been flying with 2 years before was not the same Brothers to the Rescue they were flying with now? I don't know. But I believe that many of the people were not aware or sufficiently conscious of what the change in migration policy had done to the purpose and objectives of Brothers to the Rescue. And unfortunately, that change is what provoked the shootdown of 1996.
presidente Castro dijo patria o muerte. Pero usted tiene que escoger entre un sistema político o la muerte. Los cubanos prefieren morir en el mar que morir dentro de la isla. Antes de graduarme de abogado en el año 1986, creé la primera agrupación ecologista y pacifista en Cuba. El primer choque que tuve con el gobierno cubano marcó mi mundo para siempre. Ellos me llamaron para la seguridad del Estado, es un cuartel que ellos tienen en La Habana. Me dijeron que en Cuba ninguna otra persona tenía autoridad para hablar de ecología y paz. Y en tanto yo le pregunté por qué no pudo hablar. Yo soy un joven que tengo 19 años, mi familia es comunista, soy un joven nacido en un barrio pobre, he cumplido con todos mis deberes con lo que ustedes me piden. Me dijeron que la única persona que en Cuba pudiera hablar de ecología y de paz era Fidel Castro. Por tanto, en ese momento me convirtieron en disidente y posteriormente me convertí en opositor plenamente contra el gobierno cubano.
The Cuban government, by its nature, a communist government, had tried to eradicate all forms of social organization that were not dominated by the state.
We're talking about a totalitarian government that controls every single aspect of your life. A state controls the economy, state controls education, state controls even religious activities, state controls everything.
From 1959 onward, Fidel Castro's attitude has been either you're with him or against him. You're with the revolution or you're its enemy. The revolutionary government, through its first several decades, provided free health care, free education all the way through university, a guaranteed minimum wage, and provided a redistribution of income from rich to poor.
These accomplishments also came with a price. And the price, in a sense, is that there's no freedom in Cuba. There's no political freedom. There's no political parties. There's no free press. Their judicial system has been, how should I say, less than perfect.
The European Union had not always been as critical of the Cuban government on human rights as we thought was appropriate, or as supportive of dissidents within Cuba as we thought was merited. We thought that they should be supporting human rights activists in Cuba the way they supported them in Poland. One of the answers they gave was that, well, it was very hard to deal with the dissidents in Cuba because they were so splintered. And we explained that that was in fact a conscious policy of the Cuban government to try to split and fracture every attempt to unify. And we said, well, if you think you could deal with the dissidents more easily as a consortium, why don't you tell them that? They did, and the Cuban dissidents responded.
Me di la tarea de ir puerta por puerta, manejando una bicicleta en el medio de la noche y pedirle a todos los cubanos, por favor, tenemos que reunirnos, tenemos que estar unidos en un solo partido. Y la realidad es que los cubanos somos todos uno. Los cubanos de Miami, los cubanos de Australia, los cubanos de España, todos somos uno. El Concilio Cubano nace en el año 95. Se anunció al mundo que 40 grupos de diferentes categorías políticas habían formado este concilio.
They functioned as an organization with a list of members, meeting times, and so on. And the European Union felt more comfortable dealing with them in that fashion. We thought that was great.
24th of February, it's the anniversary of Cuba's War of Independence against Spain. Because this day has historical significance, Concilio Cubano had specifically selected it to meet.
I thought it was good that the members of the Exile community show their support by being as close as they could possibly be legally to the island on the 24th of February.
Hermanos Al Rescate iba a estar cerca de Cuba, iba a estar cerca del corazón del Concilio Cubano. Personalmente, José Basurto me comunicó, vamos a estar ahí, vamos a estar contigo.
The day that the shootdown occurred was an especially significant day politically. The European Union had just concluded a visit to Havana. It met openly with Cuban dissidents. and demanded of Castro a change if Cuba wished to see relations between the European Union and Cuba improve. And in this political context of external pressure on the Cuban government, of internal pressure from dissidents, we viewed the flight as especially unwise on that day.
Concilio Cubano sent numerous letters to the Cuban government explaining that they were capable of free assembly, and the Cuban government just could not have that.
El gobierno cubano conocía la naturaleza de la reunión. El gobierno cubano conocía que esta reunión era pacífica.
There was a crackdown several days before February 24th, and most of the leaders were jailed.
125 people are being jailed and are behind Cuban jails right now that were trying to exercise their rights.
La represalia contra Concilio Cubano fue bestial. Y ellos atacaron a Concilio Cubano con toda su fuerza. Desde el día 12 de febrero fueron a allanar viviendas, ellos requisieron casas, ellos atacaron a personas, ellos pusieron en prisión a cientos de activistas de derechos humanos, personas que no tenían un arma, personas que no aspiraban a otra cosa que reunirse pacíficamente dentro de Cuba. Cuando yo estaba en prisión, en la cárcel, ellos me lo dijeron. Un alto oficial de la seguridad cubana fue a verme y me dijo, Leonel, si tenemos que sacar los tanques a la calle, lo vamos a hacer.
No government official has been able to explain to me why the Clinton administration didn't have the power and discipline to stop the Brothers to the Rescue from flying on that fatal day.
For someone who was trying to make an argument to the Cuban government that they should not fear free expression by their own citizens, it would be a strange thing for me to be trying to get U.S. citizens not to express their opinions about the Cuban government. But I believed that the activities of Brothers to the Rescue in the second half of 1995 were bordering on activities that had the potential to produce armed conflict between the U.S. government and the Cuban government. I thought that was a tragedy and something to which Brothers to the Rescue was not entitled by their constitutional rights of free expression.
Various Cuban American organizations asked Jose Basulto not to fly to Cuba on the 24th on the search and rescue mission. It was a very sensitive weekend, and they should not attempt to fly that day.
I did everything I could to try to deter Brothers to the Rescue from continuing its flights. I did so much that I was eventually ordered by the White House to stop speaking to Jose Basulto.
Nuncio or anybody else from the U.S. government had, first of all, no right to tell us not to fly, and second of all, they didn't ask us or warned us about any impending danger that we were in that Nuncio knew that was in effect.
If the Clinton administration didn't want me to fly, Basulto must have said to himself, they would have taken my license away.
In fact, the day of the shootdown, Mr. Basulto's license to fly was suspended. But under our government, citizens have a right to appeal decisions of the government, which I certainly believe they should have that right. And while you appeal a suspension of a pilot's license, you're free to continue to fly.
Mario did not know he was going to fly that Saturday, February 24th, until the night before. He received a phone call from Carlos Costa. Right away he said, yeah, I do fly. And he used to go like this as a sign of, yeah, I fly tomorrow. And he had dinner early and he went to bed. 7 o'clock I heard the kitchen cabinets, he fixed his own breakfast. I did not get up that morning to kiss him goodbye.
Juan Pablo had told me that he had a business trip, that he would be leaving on the 23rd, early in the morning. He was called by Brothers to the Rescue to fly on the 24th of February. And he told them that he was going to be out of town that weekend. And he disappeared.
On the Friday before the flight, and on the Saturday morning of the flight, I communicated with officials in the State Department, with our senior representative in Havana, and with FAA officials to try to send another strong message of discouragement to brothers not to fly that day. Does that mean I knew the Cuban government was going to shoot them down? No. Because if I did, I think I would have stood outside the Oval Office and yelled and screamed until they carried me away. Because I don't believe that if I'd known 4 people were going to be murdered that day, I would have gone home with an email sent. But I worried that it might happen.
On February 24th, we gathered here in the hangar like any other mission. I was in charge of communications that day. There was a lot of tension in the air with things that were happening with Concilio Cubano.
We were actually conducting a standard search and rescue mission, but that day had the peculiarity of what was going on in Havana.
24th February started off just like every other day does for me. Our responsibilities are looking for any sort of criminal activity having to do with general aviation aircraft. We had information from the FAA that it was possible the Brothers to the Rescue were going to go out and fly, and maybe even penetrate Cuban airspace. If they did, they asked us to take pictures of it, screen prints of it, so we were, of course, paying special attention to them when they took off.
That particular day, in the other planes, there was Mario de la Peña and Armando Alejandri, and Carlos Costa with Paulo Morales. In our flight, there was Jose Basulto, the pilot in command, sitting on the left-hand side. I was sitting on the co-pilot seat on the right. Luis Iriondo was right in the back of me. And Andrés Iriondo was on the left.
These are actual screen prints, the radar screen of the day, the 24th of February, that show the aircraft as they head their way down from Florida towards Cuba.
Parallel 24th is the dividing line between the United States and Cuba, and for air control purposes, U.S. takes care of the north, Cuba takes care of the south. That doesn't mean that those are waters that belong to Cuba or to the United States. They're international waters.
Buenas tardes, Centro Habana. Por favor, estamos cruzando el paralelo 24 en 5 minutos y mantendremos unas 3 a 4 horas en su área. Estamos respondiendo 1222, 500 pies o más. Centro Habana recibido. Y para su información, Centro Habana, el área de operaciones nuestras al norte de La Habana en el día de hoy, así que estaremos en su área y en contacto con usted. Tiene un saludo cordial de Hermanos Al Rescate y de su presidente, José Basulto, que le habla. Ok, recibido, señor. Le informo, la zona al norte de La Habana está activada. Corre usted peligro al entrar por debajo 24 norte. Estamos conscientes que estamos en peligro cada vez que cruzamos el área al sur del 24, pero estamos dispuestos a hacerlo. Es nuestra condición de cubanos libres.
We had heard those threats time and time again. They were trying to stop Brothers to the Rescue by threats and fear, as they do things in Cuba, but it didn't work with us. And they knew that those threats were meaningless to us, so we proceeded.
As the 3 aircraft moved down past the 24th parallel, still in international airspace, I just kept taking screen prints. And I noticed a high-speed target take off out of the Havana area. By the way it was maneuvering, by the speed that it was doing, it seemed pretty apparent to me that it was a Cuban fighter. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if you have an anti-Castro group heading down towards the Cuban Air Defense Identification Zone, and you've got a Cuban military fighter airborne in what looked like a combat air patrol waiting for them to come, that there was a distinct possibility there was going to be trouble.
Adelante, si me oye, con 13. 330 por la izquierda.
Hay un golpe de gran víctima ahí.
Sí, yo lo vi ahorita.
Búscalo por debajo de ustedes. One Charlie. Hi, Charlie. You got that boat in front of you? No, you got a block mile mark. No, sir, 11 o'clock, you got a boat? Yeah, I'm over flying the boat. Get ready. Mike is 23, 28, 82, 29. You want me to wait for you here? Yeah, why not?
Definitely we were flying further south than normal, mainly because we had the Iriondo couple with us, and Sylvia was so excited to see the shoreline. For the first time, she was looking at the Havana skyline, and she wanted to take some videos and so forth.
I called the Southeast Air Defense people, and I asked them if they saw the high-speed primary target, which is just our technical terminology for a fighter aircraft. I said, do you see the high-speed primer? And they said, yeah, we see it. I said, well, you know, it looks like a MiG to me heading into international airspace, heading right for the United States. I think people would expect you to do something about it. And they told me, we are. I said, don't worry, we understand it, we've got it all under control. Don't worry about it. And so I hung up.
Mike is going to stay around 8230. A la vista los hechos. Es una avioneta. Dame instrucciones.
When we turned left, in other words, going towards the east, starting our line of search and rescue, Basulto is talking to Havana.
Un saludo cordial, les reportamos a 12 millas al norte de La Habana, procediendo nuestro rumbo de búsqueda y rescate hacia el este. En este momento, un día muy bonito y La Habana luce muy bien desde donde estamos. Un saludo cordial para usted, para todo el pueblo de Cuba, de parte de Hermanos Al Rescate.
I saw MiGs coming by.
Van a tirar, sube la barba. No, van a tirar. ¡Esa! ¡Autoriza los cojones! Charlie, Indigo Mike. One, have you heard from Charlie? Está en la región donde cayó. Tenemos la avioneta a la vista. Zero Charlie, are you with us? Zero Mike, 01. Here, are you with Charlie? Negative. You want to try? Well, never mind. Can you see that smoke to my left? I don't see anything now. I did see smoke. Compañero, está en el lugar de los hechos. Donde cayó el objetivo. Hace falta que nos autoricen. Está autorizada la otra. Bárbaro, vamos, puesto. If you see smoke from the low of the MiG. I didn't see the MiG. I saw smoke and a flare. Okay, we're looking to another flare, another ball of smoke. Charlie, is that you? Zero Mike. Zero Mike, 01.
I didn't know if they were dead. Maybe I didn't want them to be dead. I couldn't tell them they are dead. I didn't see them dead. I mean, you see an explosion, and you know that chances are that nothing left. But I didn't see it.
We received a phone call from Coquilares. He was the dispatcher at the hangar, and he told Mario, "We have lost contact with your son's plane, and you need to come to the hangar."
When we got to the hangar, it was packed with reporters and people trying to get in. And at that point, I'm still asking them, is he flying? Nobody would tell me, wouldn't answer my question.
Something very tragic that we have dreaded for a long time, I believe happened today. I believe we lost our first pilots.
I still had hope that maybe they would have been forced to land in Cuba and they've been arrested. That was my hope. Never thinking that they were actually shot down.
Jamás en mi corazón ni en mi mente pensar que me lo fueran a pulverizar en el aire. Jamás pensar que mis propios hermanos cubanos fueran a tocar un botón para hacer polvo la vida de mi hermano. Eso nunca, porque mi hermano no estaba en guerra.
What I envisioned was like a little bullet or something hitting like a wing and knocking it into the water. And I couldn't sleep that night at all, because I was just wondering what my dad was doing floating in the water.
Castro had put out a piece of news that there was one pilot, one survivor from the shoot-down, and that he was talking.
All the family started calling around and said, there's a survivor, it might be my son, or it might be my brother, it might be whatever. And I never believed that.
Then I remembered the night before at the hangar, someone had said that Juan Pablo Roque had infiltrated Brothers to the Rescue and had gone back to Cuba the day before. Right away, the thought of a pilot alive speaking, I said, that's Juan Pablo Roque. That's Juan Pablo Roque. He's back in Cuba, and he's part of the Cuban government.
Now, we insisted and insisted and insisted that they keep on searching, to the point, and they said, we are not searching any further because our intelligence tells us that the missiles were so powerful that never are we going to find anything. I mean, there is no trace of them, there's nothing to find in the ocean, there's no debris, there's absolutely nothing. Nothing was clear when this all started. We were just families that were thrown into something that we had no idea what had happened. It took us a while to even believe that there had been a shoot down and they were dead.
Castro wasted no time sending out communications and press releases internationally.
Tenemos con nosotros un piloto de ese grupo de violadores que tantas acciones contra nuestro país ha realizado. Hasta hace unas horas estuvo con ellos. Este piloto sabe mucho.
Roque's mission was to appear in front of the media and explain to the media that that day we had, again, a terrorist activity in progress, that we had been shot down, that he survived, and that he was the only survivor, and he was blaming, of course, me.
The last time I saw Juan Pablo Roque was on the 23rd of February in the morning, when he was leaving to go on this alleged business trip. The next time I saw him, I witnessed his walking down the stairs of Cubana de Aviación airplane on television as the reporters and the FBI arrived and surrounded my home.
It's devastating. It's really devastating because to everyone it's a big fat story, but to me it's my life and the person that I love.
He was very consistent, persistent, reliable. You know, a single mom with 2 kids. Those are qualities that will win you over. Nowhere in my mind could I accept that he had lied to me for 4 years and used me for 4 years, and everything had been
a fraud, a facade.
Esa es la idea central y ese es el mensaje que ha querido José Basurto mandar al mundo de la organización Hermanos Al Rescate. El alma de esa organización es una organización contrarrevolucionaria.
En torno al incidente ocurrido en la tarde de ayer en aguas jurisdiccionales cubanas, el Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores dio a conocer la siguiente nota. Entre las 15:21 y las 15:28 horas del 24 de febrero fueron derribados por aviones de nuestra Fuerza Aérea 2 aviones pirata a distancias entre 5 y 8 millas al norte de la ciudad de La Habana.
Compañero, ¿me podría decir cuál es su opinión con respecto a la nota que sacó la Cancillería el día de hoy?
La opinión mía es la opinión de todo el pueblo de Cuba en estos momentos, que sencillamente nosotros no permitiremos jamás que osen o invadir nuestra tierra sin el permiso de nuestro pueblo.
Es que hace rato que debían haberle tirado a esos aviones, porque eso es una falta de respeto a la soberanía de una población.
El otro no se lo tumbamos porque se quedó fuera del área. Lo que tenía era que haber entrado también, que también lo íbamos a tumbar.
Que sepan que donde sea, como sea,
sí señor,
para que sea, comandante y jefe.
Y no es que lo que vinieron, cualquiera que venga lo vamos a hacer igual, que venga el que quiera.
The incident occurred over Cuban territory. There is a right under international law to stop that.
The Cubans deny that any of the planes were shot down over international airspace. The Cubans maintain that all 3 had entered Cuban airspace and 2 of them were shot down over Cuban airspace.
This is a type of situation that probably we wouldn't have found out exactly what had happened because we had 2 sets of information. Cuban radar had them penetrating their territorial waters. U.S. radars had them outside. We were lucky enough that there were 2 boats underneath where the planes were shot down. One was a fishing vessel.
Boom, he hit that thing and tumbled about 3 times and fireballed. First plane went down about 25 miles from Cuba. The second plane went down about 28 miles.
The other was cruise ship, Majesties of the Sea, that immediately took radar positions with several different instruments.
Looks like a flare going off under the wing. And about that time, a missile shoots out from it. And I look down and there's a small plane banking. Boom, gone.
This is what turned out to be internationally the location of the shoot down of the planes and the location that was believed.
The Cuban government had not really followed international norms, and in subsequent investigations of the shoot down, that came out very clearly from a variety of international organizations.
The third plane, piloted by Basurto, did penetrate Cuban airspace briefly in a line parallel to the Cuban coastline. They were taking videos of the coastline of Havana. 2 of the planes proceeded west-east close to Cuban territorial waters. These 2 planes were always outside Cuban airspace.
There is no doubt in my mind that planes intruding on U.S. territory and deemed to be hostile would be shot down, no matter where they were. And I think that the Cubans responded in exactly the same way. So this question of, if you like, the exact letter of the law is, I think, quite meaningless. They were going to shoot him down, then they shot him down. They weren't concerned with that kind of legality. I say they, I mean the Cuban government, and certainly not the MiG pilots.
It's never appropriate to shoot down what are known to be civilian planes that have shown no hostile intent and no evidence of armament, whether it's over international airspace or not over international airspace.
Not even after 9/11, not even with the changes in international aviation law that have happened after that, there's a very set protocol. You dip your wings, you fly next to the plane, you escort the plane to the ground, you establish radio communications. There is no way that you can shoot down a civilian aircraft without going through all of these warnings.
The Sunday following the shoot down, various Cuban American organizations put together a rally to show their support for the families and for Brothers to the Rescue after what had happened.
It is within our power
You could just feel the loss. Everyone knew that something really sad had happened to our community that day.
When I first got the phone call that says there were 2 airplanes down, obviously your heart goes out to the families who were shot down. And is the Coast Guard on station? How can we help the Coast Guard with search and rescue? Then the next is kind of anger. I knew instantly that all the work that a lot of very good people were doing, trying to move this policy of hatred away from the precipice, was down the drain.
For 46 minutes, MiGs were heading toward the United States and not one F-16 was set up. There's a serious breach of security that needs to be explained by the U.S. Air Force, by the Defense Department, and we need to find out why all this happened.
Why were U.S. military aircraft not sent to protect U.S. civilian aircraft, even after a U.S. Customs radio officer placed an emergency call to the United States Air Force?
The pilots were sitting on their airplanes with their engines running, ready to go and assist our planes, and never ordered to leave. That, in my book, creates a situation of complicity. Brothers to a Rescue was an obstacle in the relations between Cuba and the United States, and since the government of the United States under Bill Clinton could do nothing legally against us, they decided to let something illegal take place.
Later on, in personal conversations with people who were associated with the Air Defense Group, I said, look, I know you guys. I know fighter pilots. I know you wanted to go after those Cuban interceptors. You lived for this opportunity. And the comment I got back was, yeah, we did want to go. In fact, the boss was pounding, literally pounding on the console, asking for permission to launch.
There had been instances in the past where there were MiGs in the Straits of Florida, and we would receive calls from F-16s suggesting we turn around and report back to Yopalak Airport. That day we didn't receive any calls or any radio communication advising us that there were MiGs in the area and that there was a hostile environment.
I don't see that the U.S. had to take any action just because there were MiGs flying. MiGs had flown close to Brother to the Rescue planes 5 or 6 times before.
The MiGs flew all the time. We monitored when they took off, when they landed. They were flying to combat air patrol 90 minutes, 70 minutes, depending on how much fuel, so many days a week. It was almost a routine. There was a normal pattern of activity from my perspective.
When the first plane went off the radar screen, there was cause for concern, but the reaction would not have been immediate because this has happened many times before when they were flying low to spot a rafter. So the mere fact that you lose plane from radar does not signify that the plane is shot down. By the time everybody understood what was happening, and again, we're talking about seconds and minutes here, the second plane was gone too.
Nobody expected the Cubans to come out into international airspace. And when they did, it simply didn't match any of the plans that they had been given. If something comes up completely out of left field, then it's going to take the military a little bit of time to react.
We don't allow sub-commanders, joint task force commanders, the authority to launch airplanes unless there are written rules of engagements that have been approved ahead of time, unless it is clearly in defense of the United States, that it's unquestionable that the United States is under attack. And neither of those conditions existed. I think people that would expect me as the operational commander to take an instant decision to go attack Cuba does not understand what a democracy is all about. The military does not go to war on its own. That is a decision of the President of the United States and the Congress of the United States.
The downing of unarmed, defenseless civilian pilots calls for a strong response. I'm tired of hearing the word exile. They are United States citizens.
This most recent action sends a message to the Clinton administration that the United States should not negotiate with terrorists.
Imagine if these things were happening in apartheid South Africa or Pinochet's Chile.
Either through provocation or by accident, the Castro issue has been placed on the front burner, and Castro once again becomes the enemy we most love to hate. But we can negotiate and prevent what I believe is a confrontation that may be coming between the Cuban government and our government, perhaps a violent confrontation.
United States have to do something about this. If they wouldn't want to do something, they should let us do something. Us, the Cuban here in Miami, will do something.
We are going to continue confronting the Castro government. You have our pledge. We have more airplanes and pilots left.
He has downed 2 civilian planes with American flag, American citizen on board, engaged in a humanitarian mission, and we consider this an act of war.
The Cuban-American community is perceived throughout the United States as a right-of-center group that's very much into violence, and that is not the case. We run the gamut from people who are total pacifists to people who would advocate violent overthrow of the government. However, those are the two extremes. Most of us fall somewhere around the middle.
Armed conflict is the last thing that everybody wants. We don't want that. But I think there's much can be done yet to send in Castro a strong message. You're the one who has to change. You're the one who has created this mess. It's up to you to change or you'll go down.
If you could talk to Castro, what would you say to him tonight?
Drop dead.
Like every other bureaucracy, you have a responsibility to give the President of the United States options. And they range from do nothing to attack.
One military option was a strong military option. There would have been more than one strike, and perhaps even an expeditionary force. Then there was a moderate military option, which would have been a punishing option, a few rockets shot here and there. And then there was the least painful option in terms of bloodshed, and that was for Clinton to sign the Helms-Burton bill. And Clinton, thank God for his wussiness, chose that third option.
As I sign this bill into law, I do so in the name of the 4 men who were killed when their planes were shot down on February the 24th. Armando Alejandre, Carlos Costa, Mario de la Peña, and Pablo Morales. In their memory, I will continue to do everything I can to help the tide of democracy that has swept our entire hemisphere finally reach the shores of Cuba.
The Helms-Burton legislation originated because Senator Jesse Helms wanted to further tighten the embargo on Cuba. But there was a lot of opposition because some elements restrict the rights of foreign countries to do business in Cuba. So it had this extraterritorial quality which caused a great deal of commotion and anger among U.S. allies.
Most of the rest of the world believes that our policy towards Cuba should be based on the interests of the United States, the national interests of the United States, and be a foreign policy, when in fact our Cuba policy is more like a domestic policy. It's more about voters in Florida and New Jersey than it is about what the national interests of the United States should be with regard to our relations with Cuba.
We have happened to stray in between Castro and the government of the United States. They are trying to maintain this as a status quo situation that has prevailed through the last 30-some years, and we are being an obstacle to that. We're bringing the case of Castro once again back into the public eye, into a public review, and this is something that the U.S. cannot permit us to do.
I believe that Mr. Busutto is either very foolish or very reckless in his conduct. On that day, in particular, and in the months leading up to it. If anyone owes an apology to the victims, in addition to the Cuban government, it is certainly Mr. Busutto for leading them into a condition that threatened and ultimately took their lives.
I don't think that Busutto feels responsible for this tragic incident. And if he does, he should. I consider him a freedom fighter. I consider him an individual, you know, with principles and committed to the freedom of our country.
I was the lead aircraft on that mission. I was the one flying closer to Cuba. I always chose that position because I considered that the danger that was there, if anybody was going to get anything from Cuba, it was going to be me.
As a leader of PTTR and having been warned in advance by the U.S. government and by Cuban exile organizations in Miami not to fly that day, he should not have flown.
We all knew what we were doing as individuals. There was no compulsory order there to act the way we did. We all went there on our own accord. And we knew that every time that we flew close to Cuba, it was dangerous.
I honestly do not think that any of them were aware of the dangers as he was. He was the one person there who had familiarity both with aircraft, flights, and political implications. However, I want to make it very clear, the responsibility for this shutdown rests squarely with the Cuban government. It was Fidel Castro as head of state, Raul Castro as head of the armed forces, every single individual down the chain of command, up to the pilots who shot down the aircraft who were responsible for this. There's nobody else to blame. U.S. may not have acted as forcefully as they should have. Mr. Basulto may not have acted as prudently as he should have. But it is Castro and his government. They are the responsible party.
Yo di la orden de comunicar a la Fuerza Aérea que no se podía volver a permitir lo que ocurrió el 9 y el 13 de eso. Pero estas operaciones son muy rápidas. Entran en cuestión de minutos.
Cinco generales se le da las facultades. Yo decía que traten de tumbarlo arriba del territorio. Pero ellos entraban a La Habana y se iban a la ciudad. Claro, con un cohetazo de eso, un avión, lo que viene para abajo, una bola de fuego y que va a caer arriba de la ciudad. Y uno, túmbenlo en el mar cuando se aparezca. Y no consulten los que tienen las facultades.
Ellos tenían la facultad de hacerlo. Y yo asumo la responsabilidad de eso. No trato de eludir en lo más mínimo la responsabilidad.
Castro has maintained himself in power by making it clear to every domestic opponent that there's no chance for them to have any space politically while he is in power, and that there's no chance for any external enemy to survive if he can have anything to say about it. That message, external and internal, has kept Castro where he is for the last 40 plus years. And it was, in a strange way, threatened or undermined by the existence of the brothers to the rescue flights.
I think he did it purposely so he could get his people's mind away from what the dissidents were trying to stir up. These are people that are taking him to task about human rights, about individual freedoms, about collective freedoms, about what the future of Cuba would be. So this is a very, very big threat. Whenever they have an internal problem, they try to turn it towards the exterior being the United States. So let's make this an attack from the U.S. on us, and let's turn united against the common enemy, the U.S. The small Cessnas, the BTTR planes, were the symbol of the common enemy, and that's why they were shut down.
Nunca hemos hecho ese tipo de cosas. Eso es inmoral. Eso es inaceptable. La moral nuestra no admitiría estar inventando cosas para distraer a otras. Nunca lo hemos hecho en 37 años. Además, por otro lado, todo estaba marchando perfectamente bien.
There very quickly came to be a political consensus both in the Congress and in the Clinton administration that passing the Helms-Burton legislation would be the United States' response to this shoot-down.
I believe that the response of the U.S. government, it was an election year, it was targeted at the Cuban American community, and it was not targeted at the fact that it was a violation of human rights, and justice was meted in a very small dose, if at all.
I was kind of naive. I never thought that a government would order a shoot down in international airspace and the United States not do anything about it.
After elections in 1996, after President Clinton was reelected, we were not that important anymore. We realized that we shared the bond that nobody else shared, and that we could be used by the US government, we could be used by the Cuban government, we could be used by the Cuban exile community, and we didn't want that. We had to shoulder the responsibility of getting justice. We, the families, were meeting together at least once a week, and we were just trying to brainstorm every single week as to what we could do. We had to research human rights law and understand that for the past few years, even before the shoot-down, people in very disparate parts of the world had found out that hurting terrorist governments in their pockets is where it really hurt them. They couldn't care less if they were labeled terrorists. They couldn't care less if they were labeled violators of human rights. But once you went after financial settlements, they got very upset.
It is impossible for the United States to indict and try Fidel Castro. Families would have much preferred that. What was available to them was the pursuit of a judgment under the Anti-Terrorism Act and an enforcement against Cuba's blocked assets.
After we had consulted with the White House, we were reassured that they would be supportive of our action. We felt empowered and confident that we could have our day in court. After we filed civil action, we started seeing a totally different reaction from the US government. At one point, we asked Michael Renneberger, head of Cuba desk, why don't you come down and sit at the trial? Sit at the trial? Me? We cannot take sides? I said, what do you mean you cannot take sides? These are the families against the Cuban government. I didn't think this was a matter of taking sides. He never showed up.
A United States court has just found Cuba and the Cuban Air Force guilty of the premeditated murder of Carlos, Armando, Mario, and Pablo. Cuba has been exposed as a terrorist country and a constant violator of human rights.
The use of blocked assets to penalize terrorist governments are one of the few available techniques for individuals to pursue justice.
We thought it would be a fairly simple thing. After all, this is Cuba's money. There's this judgment against the government of Cuba. We should be able to get this money. Okay, first day we go to court. I mean, words cannot express the shock that we felt when we saw that we're seated on one side of the courtroom, on the other side of the courtroom, while the Cuban government and the US government seated at the same table. It was like the whole world was against us. We just could not believe it. All through this portion of collecting money, the US was totally against us taking that money. There were several offers who pay us with taxpayers' dollars. We said that we definitely did not want a single penny from US taxpayers' money. This had to be in Cuba's face. So we stood firm on that, and eventually they gave us the frozen assets. And it did bother the Cuban government a lot, so I'm very happy as to that. We set a precedent with a civil case, it being the first one. Others followed. There's been, as of this date, maybe 12 or 14 cases. the U.S. government has to make a strong stand against every single act of terrorism, no matter where it occurs, no matter what group of population it occurs to, no matter if your beliefs are different from those of the people who were killed. That doesn't really matter. What matters is if someone's human rights are violated, your human rights are being eroded.
There have been unspeakable wrongs committed by the Cuban government against its own people. There have been wrongs committed against the Cuban people by others, including the U.S. government. And that, for the good of the future of Cuba, is going to require a process of reconciliation.
I think the shoot-down stopped a trajectory that was going toward bettering relations. And it began a trajectory that began to lead to worse relations. And I think that's where it's gone. As far as I know, Castro has yet to miss a meal or a conjugal opportunity. I have not seen him punished. The Cuban people, I think, have suffered. They have been punished. But that is not the object of U.S. policy. Now, as long as Fidel can keep his enemies obsessed, in a Machiavellian sense, he's winning.
Fidel is going to die. Raul is going to die. Don't wait for them to die. Start shaping the policy in Washington, D.C. If we can talk to the North Koreans actively, if we can normalize relationships with Vietnam, if we can rearm Germany a few years after World War II, then certainly we ought to have the political courage to say to 10 million people, we want you on our side. We want you to be part of this international community of people.
The shoot-down turned the clock back in U.S.-Cuban relations. It provided a cover for the Cuban government to destroy Concilio Cubano, a cover for the roundup and imprisonment of more than 100 people on the island. It increased the likelihood that someday there will be American troops in Cuba dealing with problems like the problems we're dealing with in Iraq. I hope I'm wrong about that. I really hope I'm wrong about that.
Sometimes when I'm very angry, I complain and say, you know, if there's a heaven on Mando and you're there and I get to go there someday, you're really going to hear me, because we've been left with a burden that, you know, justice should not be a burden, but when one has to look for it so alone, it becomes a burden. My brother Armando was the type of person who believed that it's no excuse to say that things are too hard and one person cannot make a change. One person can and should try and make change, even if it's a very little change.
Usted puede adquirir una copia inédita de este documental Shoot Down por Amazon.